this point, I'm ready to actually remove the wood frame from this kind of extra material out here. So I need a good sharp X-Acto blade and straight edge to help keep those lines straight, especially on the glue tabs. I should be able to just use the edge of the wood framing to guide my blade here. Be sure that as you're cutting, you're pulling the blade straight back and not cutting into an angle. The wood is so soft and the blades are so sharp that you'll end up making up your wood. If you can't get it quite that well, lay the straight edge on top of the wood frame and let the blade run along the edge of the plastic. So with all the pieces cut out, we can now start to begin to sort of fold right along these creases. Now, it'll be really important to make sure that you left a little bit of a seam here. If you didn't leave that seam there, these two edges won't fold very cleanly. As long as you left just a little bit of space there, there's enough paper in between each one of those seams in order to fold those up into place. I'll make sure that I fold my glue tabs over, add a little bit of glue to these edges, and then wrap the whole thing up. Once the glue's set up enough, I don't have to hold it down quite so much with my fingers. There's no real great easy way to clamp this in place. I can't add one of these weights to it, so I'm just using the kind of clamping force of my fingers to pinch that together. But once the glue seems to have set, there's a couple things that we can do in order to sort of fine-tune this thing. I'm not going to sand it yet, not until I have guaranteed that the glue has sort of set completely. If the seams seem to be opening up just a little bit, like I have a small opening right on top here, I could come in and add just a tiny little bit of glue into that seam, or just kind of hold it a little bit longer into that pinch spot. The glue itself dries flexible, so you know that it can kind of stand up to a little bit of abuse once you've got it, but you've got to make sure that you kind of keep that joint closed for the entire time that the glue is still wet. So just be patient with it, hold it with your fingers, give it a minute or so, and it should set up just fine. Okay, so I've left my glue up to sit for a while, and I was having a little bit of trouble right in this seam. It just kind of wanted to keep opening up on me, so I was looking around my studio trying to find a clamp that would hold it tight, but not too tight. I didn't want to mank up the wood on the edges here, so these clothespins they held it just tight enough. They make sure that they kind of close the seams up, and then they, because it's a wood on wood contact, didn't mess up the balsa wood too much. So if you happen to have a couple of these around, it'll save you the time of just kind of sitting here holding it with your fingers. Once I've got this piece sort of glued up, I can kind of put it back into my space and kind of mock up the kind of final look of it. I sort of like the way this is going. What I was hoping for by the time I wrapped up this whole project was that here we go, got to turn around, that the form would sort of finish off the kind of curvature of that stone. And what I liked was a structure that sort of fit underneath the overhang and then kind of wrapped it up. To put the absolute final touches on this model, we'll reach into your studio kits and find that scrap of sandpaper. I think I've got mine tucked into my sketchbook. Yeah, here we go. So the sandpaper I gave you is likely maybe a 150 grit or maybe a 220 grit. If you flip it over, you may even see some of the markings on the back. Basically, the way sandpaper goes is that with the higher the number, the finer the grains, or the tighter the grains are of the abrasive. And so you'll find that if you get like a 60 grit or an 80 grit sandpaper, it's really coarse. 150, 220, that's getting into the more finishing territory. And what we'll do is you'll be able to kind of carefully lay your structure on that piece of sandpaper. I recommend making sure that the surface you've got it sitting on is nice and flat. That way you're kind of using the flatness of the surface to flatten any inconsistencies that might be on the bottom of the piece. If your piece started to wave a little bit, or maybe your joints lifted up, this way it'll sort of clean up all of those edges. So when you're sanding this off, make sure that you keep your hands very, very close to the edge here, and that way you're holding the piece flat against the surface of the table. All these kind of bits and pieces here of pulp and fiber, I mean, that's wood that has now been abraded off of the edges of your piece. And so keep in mind that the more you sand, the thinner and thinner your wood gets. The balsa wood will really sand quickly. It's a very, very lightweight, kind of porous, it's basically like a hard foam more than wood. If you've got the basswood strips, those are a little bit stiffer. They'll stand up to a bit more sanding. Now, this is pretty much a finished piece. I'm just going to eyeball that in the final arrangement one more time. This looks pretty good. Now, if I was going to come back to this piece and do a little bit more work and maybe design a third model, I think what I would really like to do is match the sort of irregularities of the rock to the structure a bit more. I see this void in here now, and in sort of a simplistic sense, this is sort of a triangular wedge, but it's kind of a low resolution match, right? I didn't really carefully match this edge. If I work up another version of this, I think what I'll do is use some of my split or riven timbers and lay them in, carefully kind of matching the irregularities and the curves of the rock surface to the mating edge between the natural and the designed object. And then off the backside, keep that more geometric look and facing to it.